Relocate that dilapidated vehicle immediately. What is that corroded, antiquated pickup doing positioned in the middle of the parking area? The senior gentleman stayed in the driver's seat, his time-worn hand poised on the ignition key. Abruptly, the door on the passenger's side swung open and an individual attired in a complete military dress uniform alighted, standing erect beside the pickup. What reason would a general have for exiting the automobile of an elderly man who had just been treated with such discourtesy? Earl Matheson, at 78 years of age, had previously worked as a logistics driver for the armed forces, having entered retirement in 1981. His official military history, detailing 3 tours of duty over several decades, lay tucked away in his bureau, turning brittle and sallow with time, remembered by no one save himself. Following the passing of his spouse, Margaret, 5 years prior, Earl resided by himself in their unassuming one-level dwelling, characterized by discolored exterior paneling and an immaculately kept garden. The garden stood as Margaret's enduring creation. The time-worn blue-silver pickup truck situated in the drive was Earl's possession. He seldom operated a vehicle in recent times. His joints, afflicted with arthritis, objected each instance he ascended into the driver's compartment, and his retirement income scarcely paid for fuel. Nevertheless, on Fridays, with unwavering regularity, Earl started the engine of the old Ford and made his way to the urban community center to collect his Veterans Food Assistance box. This specific Friday morning presented unseasonable warmth for the beginning of October. Earl had taken pains with his attire, neatly creased khaki pants, a button-front shirt that, while showing signs of wear, retained its sharpness from being ironed, and his old leather work boots buffed to a muted luster. No sense in allowing one's standards to decline, Margaret would have remarked. The pickup sputtered twice before its motor finally engaged, a recognizable mechanical objection whose nuances Earl had come to understand throughout their 27 years together. He gently tapped the dashboard with fondness. "Only a short distance today, old companion," he whispered. "You are capable of handling that." The city center had undergone a significant transformation since his youth. Modern office complexes with shimmering glass exteriors loomed above the scarce surviving masonry buildings. The community center, formerly a distinguished hub of public activity, was now diminished by the presence of an opulent residential building adjacent to it. Earl maneuvered his truck into the designated parking area, grimacing as a sharp pang coursed through his left knee. The most convenient spots were allocated for personnel or VIP parking. Given his restricted movement, the prospect of hobbling the full length of the lot appeared formidable. Following a brief pause, he steered into an unoccupied VIP spot. The hour was early. He anticipated being gone before any significant individuals made their appearance. He had barely turned off the ignition when a lustrous black SUV drew up beside his truck. The automobile likely exceeded in value what Earl had made during his final decade of employment. Its operator, a man in his middle years wearing a costly suit, emerged, his features twisted with evident irritation. "Hey!" he shouted, his tone cutting with a sense of privileged indignation. "What do you imagine you're engaged in? This area is not designated for junk heaps. Relocate it immediately." A number of individuals close to the community center's doorway pivoted to observe. Earl perceived a warmth spreading across his face, not due to ire, but to embarrassment. He had not intended to create any disturbance. His hand shifted towards the ignition key, prepared to withdraw. "I shall just..." he commenced softly. The man interrupted him. "That truck is fit for a demolition yard, not occupying a spot meant for prominent figures. Reverse at this instant." Earl rotated the key, but prior to the engine engaging, the passenger side door, he was sure he had been unaccompanied in the vehicle, swung outward. A commanding figure alighted, straightening to his full height with military exactitude. The early sun glinted on gleaming brass insignia and commendations that decorated a flawlessly ironed Air Force dress uniform. The individual stood rigidly beside Earl's pickup, confronting the incensed driver of the SUV. The parking area grew still. The man in the suit took an unintentional step back, his demeanor transitioning from rage to bewilderment. The uniformed officer assessed the situation with composure before articulating in a distinct, commanding tone. "I must ask that no one interferes with this vehicle. The gentleman seated within it once rescued me." Earl stayed in the driver's position, his head inclined somewhat, puzzled by the events unfolding in his vicinity. The individual in uniform was General Charles Dunn, commander of the 139th Air Wing, a unit that had experienced numerous deployments throughout the Middle East conflicts. His attendance at the community center was not fortuitous, nor was his appearance from Earl's passenger seat. 2 decades prior, when Dunn served as a lieutenant in command of a compact reconnaissance team, their transport had become immobilized in a worsening urban combat zone. Hostile gunfire had escalated with the onset of darkness, communications were unreliable, and their designated retrieval location had been jeopardized. The sole individual who ventured to drive into the perilous area to recover them was Earl Matheson, at that time a 58-year-old logistics specialist who, by rights, should have been securely situated away from the front, managing supply routes. Charles had never erased from his memory that particular evening. The shriek of approaching projectiles, the suffocating particles in the air, the escalating conviction that his unit would not survive. Then, the deep sound of an oncoming engine, unbelievably resonant in that inappropriate sector of the city. A damaged transport truck had materialized through the haze, screeching to a stop next to their incapacitated transport. The operator had leaned from the cab, his face soiled with grime, his gaze keen with determination. "Get your asses in here now," Earl had yelled above the din of the battle. "I've navigated worse than this in Kisan. This is just a morning exercise by comparison." They had quickly boarded, 6 soldiers laden with gear, while Earl performed a flawless 3-point maneuver amidst enemy fire. A round had pierced the windscreen, passing mere inches from Earl's head. He had not so much as winced, continuing to drive with the same steadfast concentration. "What is your extraction?" Earl had inquired. Upon being informed that their intended departure path was probably unsafe, he had affirmed instantly, "I am aware of an alternative route. Hang on for 20 minutes." Earl had skillfully maneuvered through constricted passageways and rubble-filled thoroughfares, somehow eluding both hostile encounters and enemy surveillance. He brought them securely to the alternate retrieval site, remained until their helicopter landed, and then vanished once more into the turmoil to assist other individuals. Charles had made efforts to learn his identity, intending to see that he gained acknowledgement, but amidst the disarray of the retrieval and ensuing deployment rotations, Earl had faded into the anonymity of unsung heroes. This changed the previous month when, during a standard assessment of veteran support services in the area, General Dunn noticed a recognizable name on the assistance roster. Additional inquiries verified it was indeed the same Earl Matheson. Moreover, Earl continued to operate the civilian version of the very model truck he had driven during his service, albeit it was currently rusted and worn from years of use. Charles had quietly organized matters for that morning. He had instructed his chauffeur to take him to Earl's unassuming residence before the senior gentleman left for the community center. "Mr. Matheson," he had stated, standing on the veranda, "you likely do not recall me, but Lieutenant Dunn." Earl had cut in, comprehension gradually illuminating his features, "though I imagine that is no longer your official position." His gaze had registered the stars on Charles's uniform. "General now," Charles had confirmed. "Might I accompany you on your drive today?" Earl had appeared perplexed by the inquiry. "It is merely the day I collect my food supplies, nothing out of the ordinary." "You indicated you had no one to go with you," Charles had responded. "This day you will." The journey had proceeded largely in quietude, with Earl intermittently indicating notable sights that had transformed over the passing years. He had refrained from questioning why a general would wish to travel in his corroded truck, and Charles had not offered an explanation. Then ensued the altercation in the parking area, when the individual in the SUV had started to verbally abuse Earl. Charles had arrived at an immediate resolve. This man, who had rescued him and his team without pause or acknowledgement, merited protection with identical resolve. At that moment, with all eyes in the parking area upon them, General Dunn positioned himself defensively next to Earl's truck. The man from the SUV hesitated, suddenly unsure. I was not aware. Not many are, General Dunn answered calmly. That is frequently the case with the most significant individuals in our midst. He shifted his gaze to Earl, who stayed in the driver's seat, clearly ill at ease with the scrutiny. Mr. Matheson was handling logistics when most of you were learning to walk. The general went on, speaking to the small group of onlookers that had assembled. He extracted my team under heavy fire when no one else would attempt it. 6 lives saved in 20 minutes of perfect driving. Earl at last uttered, his tone subdued. You are not obliged to undertake this, General. It occurred many years past. Time does not lessen valor, sir, Charles responded with formality. And I have anticipated for 20 years the opportunity to express my gratitude appropriately. The individual from the SUV had withdrawn to his automobile, his discomfiture apparent in his swift actions. Other people in the parking lot observed with dignified quietude. Charles reached out his hand to Earl. Will you permit me to go with you indoors, Mr. Matheson? I understand they are anticipating our arrival together. Earl gradually alighted from the truck, his motions rigid due to his arthritis. He maintained an erect posture despite his unease, an inherent reaction to the military attire before him. Side by side, they proceeded towards the community center's doorway, an improbable duo that captivated notice merely by their disparity. The decorated general in pristine uniform and the elderly man in his threadbare yet respectable garments. In their wake, no one neared the time-worn truck. It stayed where Earl had positioned it, abruptly altered in the collective view from an unsightly object to an emblem of something indefinable yet deeply honored. In a matter of days, surveillance video showing General Dunn standing formally beside Earl's truck circulated widely on social platforms. The recording, first disseminated by an employee of the community center, rapidly garnered millions of engagements. Remarks arrived in vast numbers. This exemplifies true deference. The general comprehends what is truly significant. What importance does a parking space hold when one is indebted to another for their very existence? Seek out an individual who will protect you as this general protects his driver. The individual who had accosted Earl found himself the target of widespread disapproval, his actions scrutinized and denounced as indicative of deteriorating community standards. A number of veterans groups requested a public expression of regret, although Earl, upon being reached by local news, waved away the suggestion. He was unaware, Earl stated plainly. No injury was caused. However, as fascination with the narrative intensified, reporters started to explore the precise identity of the man operating the old pickup truck. Their findings astonished even individuals who believed they comprehended military duty and selflessness. Earl Matheson had completed not merely one, but 3 consecutive tours during the Vietnam conflict, choosing to undertake the third when he had the option to go back to his home. Serving as a logistics specialist, he had navigated some of the most perilous pathways through hostile territory, guaranteeing that provisions arrived at forward operating bases when conventional transport wouldn't risk the journey. His personnel file, procured via Freedom of Information requests, disclosed 17 citations for extraordinary service under adverse conditions. Nevertheless, he had not once been awarded a single medal of recognition. Every suggestion for such an honor had been returned with an identical annotation in Earl's own script, respectfully declined. Was only performing required duties? A more thorough inquiry brought to light further astonishing facts. Throughout his second tour, Earl had initiated an informal transport operation for wounded soldiers, conveying them to field hospitals during what were meant to be his off-duty times. He had altered his truck with additional cushioning and medical supplies acquired using his personal funds. Military documentation showed he had transported over 300 injured personnel in this manner, yet he had consistently omitted these voluntary missions from his official reports. He referred to it as his evening commute, recollected a pensioned medic who had worked with Earl as if it were entirely unremarkable. But those additional minutes preserved lives that otherwise would have perished awaiting authorized medical transport. Upon being questioned regarding this by an ever more captivated press, Earl gestured dismissively. Decorations are for heroes. I just drove trucks where they needed to go. However, General Dunn held an alternative viewpoint. Mr. Matheson's interpretation of required duties encompassed maneuvering into active combat zones when no other individual was willing, he clarified at a press conference. His humility has obstructed proper recognition for decades. The subsequent week, at the headquarters of the 139th Air Wing, a distinct event was organized solely to pay tribute to Earl. Notwithstanding his protests, he found himself seated in the front row of the base auditorium, enveloped by active duty personnel and veterans alike. General Dunn, speaking to the congregated audience, narrated the rescue operation that had preserved his existence and that of his team members. When I found myself disoriented in a red zone, he did not inquire about my identity, the general stated. He merely assisted me into his truck and remarked, I've hauled more important people than you out of hell before. The listeners responded with amusement, yet Earl reacted with a flicker of astonishment. He had no recollection of uttering those remarks. They had represented merely one more incident in a professional life characterized by instantaneous judgments and continuous progression. Subsequently, the event presented an unforeseen disclosure. General Dunn summoned 5 other service members representing a range of ages and official positions, from a young sergeant to a retired colonel. These individuals all possess a shared experience, the general elucidated. Every one of them was extracted from danger by Mr. Matheson amidst various conflicts spanning different decades. Each subsequently contributed to saving other lives, commanding vital operations, and returning to their homes to establish families whose descendants now also serve. Individually, they came to Earl relating concise narratives of events he had mostly allowed to fade from memory, to him standard assignments, but to them experiences that had profoundly changed their lives. You extricated my unit from an ambush in '72, stated the retired colonel. I was an apprehensive private then. Owing to your actions, I survived to command hundreds and bring them all home safely. 2003, outside Fallujah, remarked a major with a prosthetic leg, our transport hit an IED. You appeared like a ghost through the smoke. 8 of us made it out because of your driving. A lady dressed in non-military attire then came forward. I have not had the pleasure of meeting you, Mr. Matheson, she stated, but the colonel whom you saved in '72 was my father. He returned to us because of your intervention. 3 generations of my family exist because you drove into danger that day. The far-reaching consequences of Earl's simple assertion of just doing my job surpassed what anyone might have foreseen. A military historian in attendance at the ceremony calculated that Earl's direct interventions had preserved at least 412 lives throughout his career, creating a compounding positive influence on the generations that followed. Earl remained in a state of astonishment, his thoughts finding it difficult to align these accounts with what he had consistently regarded as just doing his job. The event reached its apex when General Dunn himself bestowed upon Earl the Distinguished Service Cross, an honor Earl had been recommended for 3 separate times during his career but had invariably chosen not to accept. On this occasion, Mr. Matheson, we will not permit your refusal, the general stated with conviction. Certain debts require recognition even decades later. As the medal was affixed to Earl's time-worn sport coat, the whole assembly hall stood in a prolonged show of applause. Numerous younger service members were visibly emotional, affected by the tribute to an individual who had never pursued such a claim. When Earl was at last convinced to address the gathering, he neared the microphone with evident hesitation. I am not adept at delivering speeches, he commenced, his words faltering. I have never perceived the utility in discussing events that have concluded. He paused, surveying the expanse of uniforms before him. I just drove, he continued. That was my job. If the pathway was perilous, well, an individual was required to traverse it. Preferable that it be myself than someone with a family waiting or some young person with their whole life ahead. He self-consciously touched the medal on his chest. However, I express my gratitude for this. I shall wear it in tribute to all the drivers who never got noticed. The military band commenced its performance, but an unforeseen event occurred. Earl lifted his hand, signaling them to pause. All observers looked on with astonishment as the elderly man retrieved from his pocket a time-worn photograph. Given that we are engaged in remembering things, he stated, his voice stronger now, I wish to acknowledge my own team. He displayed the photo, 5 men standing beside a dusty transport truck. Rogers, Martinez, Papadopoulos, Johnston, and Williams, my fellow drivers. None of them made it home. Whatever recognition you give me belongs to them too. The auditorium fell silent. General Dunn stepped forward, accepted the photograph with deferential hands, and promised, "Their names shall be added to our memorial wall by tomorrow, sir." Subsequently, as the formal reception drew to a close, a journalist succeeded in inquiring about Earl's future plans. Same as always, he responded with a faint smile. Friday food pickup, Tuesday doctor's appointment. Life doesn't change much at my age. And the truck? The reporter pressed. Do you have any intentions to upgrade, considering your newfound public recognition? Earl appeared genuinely perplexed by the question. Why would I get rid of my truck? We understand each other. What Earl was unaware of was that General Dunn had already initiated a further course of action, one designed to guarantee the elderly veteran would no longer face concerns regarding food assistance programs or medical transportation again. The subsequent Friday, Earl came to the community center at his customary time. On this occasion, nevertheless, the parking lot presented a changed appearance. Close to the doorway, a newly installed sign, its fresh paint glistening in the morning sun, proclaimed, "Reserved parking for the driver who saved a general." Earl gazed at it for a considerable period before positioning his truck precisely in the spot. If any individual considered it unsuitable, they refrained from voicing their views. Within the center, the standard procedure for obtaining his food assistance box had also been altered. The staff greeted him by name, no longer with the generic courtesy they extended to all recipients. Several people approached to shake his hand, including the director of the center. "Mr. Matheson, we've adjusted your benefits package," the director explained. "General Dunn's office contacted us about ensuring you receive comprehensive support." Earl attempted to object. "I don't need special." "It's not special treatment," the director interjected gently. "It's correcting an oversight. Your service record qualifies you for benefits you've never claimed." As Earl departed with his now enhanced food package, a youthful individual neared him in the parking lot. "Sir, is it true you drove into hot zones?" he inquired eagerly. Earl observed him, barely 20, with the recent haircut of a new recruit. "I drove where I was needed," Earl replied simply. "That's all." "But weren't you scared?" the young man persisted. Earl contemplated this as he arranged his groceries in the truck bed. "To feel apprehension is natural," he finally said. "Acting anyway is what matters." The young man hesitated, then asked, "My grandfather was in Vietnam logistics, James Papadopoulos. You mentioned his name in your speech." Earl froze, groceries forgotten. "Jimmy P. Yes, sir. That's what they called him." Earl's time-worn hand gripped the side of the truck for stability. "Jimmy was the best navigator I ever knew. Could read a map in pitch darkness. Saved our hides more times than I can count. My father was born 2 months after he died," the young man said. "I'm James too, shipping out next month." Earl's eyes misted. "Your grandfather would be proud." Following a brief interval, he inquired, "Would you like to see how this old truck runs? Maybe take a short drive." For the ensuing hour, Earl navigated the urban area with James seated next to him, recounting anecdotes of a grandfather whom the young man had not known, yet whose legacy he carried. It constituted the most extended dialogue anyone had observed Earl engage in for years. The subsequent week delivered a further unexpected event. A contingent of Air Force mechanics arrived at Earl's home, possessing formal authorization to perform maintenance on his truck. Over a span of 3 days, they labored to rebuild the engine, substitute worn components, and ensure every mechanical system functioned perfectly. Yet, when Earl voiced unease regarding the truck's appearance, the rust spots, the faded paint, the dented fender, the lead mechanic shook his head. "General's orders, sir. Fix the function, preserve the character," he conveyed. You told him an ugly truck is a truck with stories to tell. Earl chuckled, an occurrence that seemed like his first in years. Sounds like something I might say. Upon the mechanic's departure, the old truck purred like new, yet its external appearance remained precisely as it had always been. Battle-worn, persistent, reliable, very much akin to its owner. 1 month subsequent to the viral moment, Earl received an invitation to speak to new logistics recruits about his experiences. He initially declined, insisting he had nothing worth sharing. General Dunn personally called to change his mind. They need to hear from someone who understands that the most important missions often happen without fanfare, the general explained. Someone who knows that getting others home safely is victory enough. Earl ultimately consented to a single session. He arrived at the training facility, his old cap in his hands, expecting to speak briefly and depart. Instead, he found himself in a room where the walls had been decorated with maps of every route he had driven during his service, routes that had become legendary among transport specialists for their ingenuity and daring. "We've been teaching your techniques for years," the instructor explained. "We just didn't know who created them." Earl spoke for just 15 minutes, his message simple but profound. "I drove for this country. Now I just drive to the food bank. Both matter. Both have purpose." With the progression of the seasons, elements of Earl's quiet life also transformed. The neighbors who had barely noticed him for years now regularly stopped by. A group of veterans organized a garden expansion project, adding raised beds that Earl could tend without straining his knees. The local high school's history class invited him to share his experiences, not of combat, but of the quieter courage required to drive toward danger when instinct demands retreat. Of greatest significance to Earl was the small brass plaque that arrived 6 months after the ceremony. It had been mounted at the military transport training facility, bearing the names of his 5 fellow drivers who hadn't returned. Beneath their names was a simple inscription: "They drove so others could come home." The truck continues to be Earl's daily companion, still parked in his driveway when not in use. However, at present, younger veterans intermittently visit to assist with his yard work or to share a cup of coffee on his porch. They seek no recognition for this, perhaps understanding better than most that the most meaningful service often happens quietly, without ceremony or applause. And the time-worn blue-silver truck with its immaculately kept engine concealed by a weathered exterior has evolved into a kind of local landmark. People now indicate it to visitors with newfound respect, remarking, "That's Earl's truck. Looks like nothing special, but it sure has stories to tell."